Greg Lee. Welcome to Theology U, where we have conversations about God with academics and authors that anybody can understand. Thanks for coming on. It's really great to see you.
It's great to be with you all.
So we're going to talk about Augustine today, among other things. My first question is it Augustine or is it Augustine? The age-old question. How do we decide?
It can go both ways. If you're from Florida and you live in St. Augustine, I guess you can do it that way. And I think it might be more British to say Augustine, but I say Augustine.
Okay, good to know. I think we'll stick with Augustine because that's my muscle memory.
Yeah.
But just in case there's any confusion, we should start with who is Augustine? You've obviously done a lot of work with him, which we'll get into. But for someone who's maybe heard the name or heard quotes from him, who is Augustine? Basic overview.
Yeah, so Augustine was a bishop from North Africa who lived in the 4th and 5th centuries at the tail end of, during the Roman Empire, I should say. And he is generally considered to be the most influential theologian for Western Christianity. And that counts for both Catholics and Protestants. So you have the Reformation that divides Catholics and Protestants from each other. But both of them saw themselves as operating within the legacy and influence of Augustine, even though they're sort of pulling on different streams of his thought. So a lot of the ways that we think about the whole Christian story and a lot of the key ideas of theology come from Augustine. The basic narrative of creation, fall, original sin, God's grace, predestination, how that interacts with human free will. A lot of this stuff is sort of codified by Augustine as he's reading the Bible.
Yeah, like you said, he pretty much talks about everything. When you say he's a bishop, obviously this is way before Reformation. What did that look like? Is he like a pastor? Is he preaching to a congregation? And how did he have so much time to write all this stuff?
Okay, I'll return to that last question because it's sort of funny for me. But what is he? He is basically a pastor. And so he is preaching Sunday to Sunday. He is administering the sacraments. He is doing pastoral care. He also is involved with certain kinds of like social and political duties that most pastors might not be. So he's in charge of the distribution of alms. When people are sort of giving money to the church, he distributes that to the poor. And most interestingly, maybe, is that he is a judge who actually oversees disputes between litigants, almost like we would think of as a secular judge today. So Augustine's writing about 100 years after the conversion of Constantine, who is the first Roman emperor who becomes Christian. And one of the things that Constantine does is he elevates the bishops to be more prominent. He gives them sort of more authority in the Roman Empire. And eventually you have the development of something called episcopal courts. So it's like courts that are run by bishops. And bishops basically had to, weigh in on some like land dispute, or like a brother and sister are fighting over an inheritance or something like this. They actually have to oversee that stuff. So he is a pastor, but he also has these sort of civil duties that we might not associate with a pastor. How does he get all of his work done? Okay, so there's a footnote in this book that I have coming out. It's like maybe my favorite footnote that I've ever written, where I looked up every reference in his whole corpus where he talks about how busy he is. And there's actually a lot. I didn't even include them all in that footnote. But he has, I might have just like cited dozens of letters, and there's like dozens more, where he's basically like, I'm working all the time. I work on one book of the day. I work on another one at night. And remember, it's before like, the electric light bulb. So he's like doing this by candle or whatever. He's like, I work on Saturdays, I work on Sundays. And now you're asking me this ridiculous question about how I interpret Cicero. I'm too busy. He writes these letters back that are really, really late, like months late, to like really important officials. It's like, sorry, I'm just like so busy. I'm working on this. So it was really like heartening and autobiographically endearing for me to discover that he was like always frustrated with the demands on his time and didn't know how he was going to get everything done, and was a slow correspondent.
Yeah, that's really interesting. This is one of the reasons I think he's just such an interesting guy, because he occupies this weird like government role now that the Roman Empire has suddenly turned Christian, and he's writing all the time. He's pastoring a congregation. like he's really just doing so many things,
Mm-hmm.
which even like no one today could even do. Like there is no job that exists right now that aligns with all the things he was doing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think maybe one more quick anecdote, something like the pear tree story. Could you just give like a quick overview? What is that, and why do we still talk about
Yeah, it's sort of funny that a lot of times when you talk about Augustine, you start talking about pears. And
it? Hmm.
there's like a recent translation of his autobiography called Confessions. It just has like a big pear on the cover. So the pear tree incident is from his book Confessions, which is probably his most famous work and the one that is most read today, where he's basically home in between like different levels of schooling. So his dad is essentially putting him in like the equivalent of like a private school to get classically trained, but then runs out of money, so he has to come home for a year. And while he's there, he's sort of bored and is acting like a teenager with his friends. And there's a nearby pear tree that they steal from, and then they sort of just sort of like throw the pears to pigs, and he has to reflect on why he even did that, because they didn't want to, like, they weren't hungry, they weren't like thinking these would be especially delicious pears. They didn't even do anything with them really, so what prompted him to do that? And what he's wrestling with is that anytime anybody commits some kind of crime or a sin or some moral offense, you're looking for a motivation. Like if you put somebody on trial for murder, you want to know, was this like a jilted lover who wanted revenge and to restore their honor? Was this somebody who like was trying to steal somebody's property? If you can't provide any rational reason, like any sort of coherent reason why you would have murdered, then we almost think that you're not, within your faculties. And so you actually reduce the punishment. So what Augustine's trying to figure out is, why did I do this when I can't come up with a motivation? And there's sort of like a deeper theological issue there, which is that Augustine has this idea that uh, that everything that we desire is ultimately a desire for God. You're looking for something in whatever you're after that can ultimately only be fulfilled in God. So if it's you're looking for popularity, what you're looking for is actually like the love of God and approval from the only one whose opinion ultimately matters. If you're looking for money, you're looking for, say, security, but God is the only one who can provide you ultimate security. So the pear tree incident, he's sort of wrestling with what was I after when I was stealing those pears? Because I just can't like give an account for what it was, and there must be something. And he sort of uses that story to talk about how all sin is sort of like a failed attempt to get from God, like what you can only get from God by trying to get it from someone else or some other thing. I think the thing that he lands on is that what I was after was a share of God's omnipotence. So I wanted to do something just because I could do it. I just wanted to prove that I could break the rules and I could sort of assert myself. And that was a desire for a certain kind of autonomy and self-determination that only belongs to God, and that I was trying to mimic in a pale and shadowy way.
Hmm. Yeah, it's such an interesting story, and kind of a good glimpse into the early life of Augustine. Of course, he has this conversion as a young adult to Christianity. He didn't grow up a Christian, and he goes through this whole journey of figuring out what religion he wants to do. He's very curious, and
Mm-hmm.
eventually comes around. And this is part of his kind of self reflection, which I just think it's cool to hear from someone who we often think of as this high and mighty religious guy, and he's battling with his own like totally uh, explanation less, childhood
Mm-hmm.
misdoing. So I just think it's a cool example. Okay, so that's who Augustine is. We'll transition now to your book, Christians Among the Corrupt: Augustine, Race, and the Challenges of Immoral Communities. Could you just tell us a little bit about that book, what inspired you to begin the project, and what it's about?
Yeah, so it's a book I've been sort of interested in working on for a long time, because one of the things that really captivated me about Augustine was his writings on church unity. So I think for a lot of Protestants, you think of Christian unity mostly as spiritual. So it's like we share in the same Holy Spirit, we share the same doctrines or something along those lines, and we don't think a lot about visible unity. It doesn't matter that we're separated by denominations, or it doesn't matter if we're part of different church traditions. And Augustine's writing on church unity really stress how unity is an expression of love. And so if you're visibly disunited, if you're visibly divided, that indicates that you spiritually don't love each other. You should remain in visible fellowship with each other if you love one another. And Augustine's context, just to be clear, is very different from our own, where he's basically assuming there's sort of like one global church. He's not, he's living like 1,000 years before the Reformation. He couldn't have imagined, contemporary denominations. He's living before the division between Eastern and Western Christians and the Great Schism of 1054, this kind of thing. So he's just sort of operating with the assumption that there's basically like one church around the world, and you can't divide it. And if you divide it, it's a hateful act. You're actually like violating love by dividing from other Christians and refusing to be in fellowship with them.
So this is a bunch of church history coming at you rapid fire. Augustine lives just after Constantine has adopted Christianity for the Roman Empire. Before this, the Romans had been persecuting and killing Christians for hundreds of years, before Constantine converts to Christianity and claims it for the empire. Augustine lives in this post-Christian empire where Christianity has suddenly become beneficial for somebody looking to gain social status. The Great Schism in 1054 is the split between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Western Church over theological differences. And then, of course, the Reformation in the 15th and 16th centuries, the split between the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestants.
I found this to be a really challenging thing as a Protestant, to be thinking about the importance of visible unity. Unity is something I've thought a lot about because when I was in college, I was part of 2 campus ministries, parachurch campus ministries. One was predominantly white, one was predominantly Asian. Then there was sort of a third one that was in the mix as well that I didn't attend, but we were all, coming from the same sort of evangelical background. And I didn't know why there were 3 ministries. And I, was sort of wrestling with whether or not we should be in different ministries according to cultural or racial background and so forth. So there's some ideas that were like tucked in the back of my head back there, like from college. Later, as I was reading the writings about Christian unity, I felt really challenged to develop a more robust understanding of the church, to think about the importance of tradition, to think about my relationship as a Protestant with Catholics and with Orthodox and so forth. But then the big development for me has been over the last, 13, 14 years. I've been living in the city of Chicago as I've been teaching at Wheaton. And the neighborhood we live in is a lower income African-American community in the West Side. And so I have to commute like an hour back and forth each way to get to campus. And the environments are just really, really different. So, the kinds of challenges that my neighborhood community faces in terms of, gun violence or under-resourced schools or unemployment and poverty and incarceration and so forth, they're just really, really different from a lot of the things that you would see in a more suburban, wealthier context. And the communities are also so divided racially, right? You just see like concentrations of one race or the other in these different neighborhoods. And I'm driving this, commute back and forth, and it's like I'm literally like it feels like I'm in a different planet, like, from 1 hour to the next, twice a day kind of thing, like as I go there and come back. Then the other thing about it for me is that both communities are really, really Christian, right? I mean, I teach at Wheaton College, so it's a very vibrant spiritual community with a lot of really inspirational Christians. If you go to my neighborhood, you will see so many, Protestant communities. And if you're in my church, like arguably the Black church has, through the history of African Americans in this country, been the most defining structural institution for Black people in this country, period. And the main context in which they were able to exercise autonomy and leadership over their own affairs. And so there's this real question for me about Christian unity between racial groups and why these groups are experiencing such different, life circumstances when they're all Christian. And I've really been wrestling with the question of whether the churches are, our churches are, racially divided because they're residentially segregated. So does a segregation of our neighborhoods, where a lot of people actually don't feel comfortable even driving through the neighborhood where we live, they view this as sort of like, Chicago is known for its homicides. I'm not going to go there. I'm going to get shot, this kind of thing. Well, there's like huge Christian populations there. And so why do you have like that kind of challenge in this community and like almost nothing of that in another one? And they are both Christian. And so that's sort of cast the question of Christian unity for me in a different light, in that Augustine really helped me to think about, how do we wrestle with doctrinal differences or moral failures and things like that when you're in a community of people who are like, sort of, there's like relatively like equal power and status between them, and they're disagreeing about some issue. Like they're disagreeing about, I don't know, what's happening in Eucharist, or they're disagreeing about predestination, free will, or something like that.
When Dr. Lee mentions the Eucharist, this is just another word for communion.
So there's a way you can respond to that by saying, well, Augustine says church unity is really important, so we should figure out some way to sort of be visibly united despite some of those differences. I don't think that works as well when it comes to issues of like real disparity, social disparity within a given community, especially when part of the history is that one group has dominated or oppressed the other. And that's one of the reasons why they are separated. So I think something like 80% of Black Christians in this country attend one of the historic Black denominations, and those are formed in the context of slavery and Jim Crow. And so if that is sort of the history of why Black and white Christians are divided, you're talking about like major social historical context that needs to be addressed when you're talking about church unity. I think church unity is still really important, and I still think that there's ways in which we can appropriate Augustine in thinking about these issues, but I just think it's more complicated than just sort of ecumenical conversation between Protestants and Catholics, or Presbyterians and Methodists, or even like Democrats and Republicans or something like that. There's a different component that gets introduced when you're thinking about these sort of material realities.
Yeah, totally. Part of what makes the disparity that you're describing so striking too is that you're describing an hour drive. It's really only like 25 miles. Like it's only an hour because of how right.
Chicago
Right.
and
So
traffic is a thing. That's a very sensitive topic, Will.
yeah, well I know. But I think it drives the point even more. Like this is not 80 miles an hour. This is like 25 miles. Like if you're in Wheaton and you're at a tall building, you can see Chicago. Like it's not that far. And like you're describing, so many people wouldn't even be comfortable driving through the neighborhood where you live and have built a community. Of course, you live in Lawndale. Let's talk about first, how did you end up living there in the first place? What drove that decision? And how has it been building community and raising a family in a place where other Wheaton professors, as far as I know, are not living?
Yeah. And just to your earlier point about 25 miles between Wheaton and Lawndale. Yeah, that's true. But I'll push it even further, that even within the city of Chicago, you can look at adjacent neighborhoods, like neighborhoods that are basically right next to each other.
Mm-hmm.
I forget which neighborhoods it is, but there's like this one little stretch in which the life expectancy rate between two neighborhoods that are right next to each other is something like 25 years disparity.
Wow.
Like you expect to live 25 years longer if you live like 5 blocks north than you would if you lived 5 blocks south. So yeah, it's not far, and it's literally, just these communities that have radically different, life experiences living right next to each other. There's something morally problematic about that. So in terms of how we ended up at Lawndale, it's sort of a amazing story, in terms of my wife and me. I was preparing to take my job at Wheaton. My wife and I were dating and, eventually got engaged just before the school year, actually. And she was formerly a lawyer. We agreed that she would take the Illinois bar exam. She was coming from San Francisco. I was coming from North Carolina. And the day after she took the bar exam, I proposed. The day after I proposed, and it was sort of clear that she was also moving to Chicago as I was, we discovered a job opportunity at the Lawndale Christian Legal Center, which had just been created, about, I think, 18 months prior. and was just getting started providing criminal defense services to youth in our community. And the job came with the requirement that we live in the neighborhood and that we attend the church that started the legal center, Lawndale Christian Community Church, which was founded actually by a Wheaton alum who had moved to Lawndale in 1975 to be a high school teacher, where he was also a wrestling and football coach. So literally, like within 5 days or so after we got engaged, we suddenly found ourselves being given this opportunity to enter this community before I had even started my first year at Wheaton. In the midst of all that, we had sort of heard about the church like just shortly before we had gotten engaged and visited it randomly, and randomly received a tour of the church and its ministries, and learned the history of the neighborhood and so forth. And I got this very, very strong desire to be part of this community, but also didn't know how to enter it. I mean, I was sort of random person starting at Wheaton who had no connection to this church, or the broader community, no background in a neighborhood like where we are now. So I sort of wanted to be part of the church, but then didn't know how to get involved. And then it was fast forward like maybe a week or two later that suddenly this opportunity materialized, and it came with the requirement that we move in. So it was actually what I really wanted. I wanted like some kind of hook, but I could have never imagined, it's happening. So that's sort of where it all started. And we've had a remarkable experience in the community. It's really been, one of the greatest gifts I feel like God's ever given, me and our family to be to living in such a remarkable community. Our church has started. It's sort of like a unique church that started a series of ministries to serve the needs of the local community. So, in addition to the legal center, there's a very prominent health center that provides, care for those who don't have health insurance or lower income. There's a development corporation that works on affordable housing and other building projects. There's, an arts center. There's an addiction recovery and prison reentry ministry where men live for 9 months in a facility, sort of getting off drugs, readjusting to mainstream society after, many years in prison. So there's a series of ministries, and it's a very kind of like holistic mission where, we preach the gospel at our church. We believe in, salvation by faith, and you have to believe in Jesus, and we believe the Bible is God's word and so forth. But we also have a commitment to loving God and neighbor. And we believe that loving neighbor means that you think about the neighborhoods that promote or challenge the flourishing of your neighbor. So if you really love your neighbor, you have to think about their social context and the community that they're a part of and the unique challenges that they face. And so if we really want to love our neighbor, we have to love our neighborhood and be committed to it. So that has been for me a really inspiring vision for ministry. It's something that I really take into the classroom with me at Wheaton. It's something that's shaping the books that I read, the things that I care about. It's a neighborhood where I feel like I really see the kingdom of God. Like there's just like these amazing stories of people who have really grown up in some of the hardest circumstances you can imagine, in terms of poverty, in terms of, having gone to prison or having, experienced personal violence against their bodies and so forth. Really sort of intense stuff. And then you just sort of see these transformed lives and families restored and, people getting jobs and able to pay for their rent and, really being stable and contributing to society. So it's something that continually inspires me. And it's also a unique community in that there's a population of what we call relocators, which is basically like people like me who are coming from a context of more material resources, who are just attracted to the mission of the church and its ministries and are there to be part of God's work there. And so those people are also really inspirational. They're there, for a reason. They have a very strong commitment to the neighborhood, very sincere and vibrant faith. And so I just feel like I'm always surrounded by like the most encouraging Christians that I could imagine. And I just soak it all in. It's something that really keeps me going in my own spiritual life.
Yeah, that's great stuff. I want to focus on something you said earlier. You said that difference between neighborhoods, particularly those that are really close, is morally problematic. Could you explain why you think that's the case? What makes it a moral issue?
Yeah, well, think about a passage like the Good Samaritan, right? The way that Jesus tells that story is that, you have a priest walking down this road where there's this man half dead on the side. And the
Hmm.
first thing, the way that the priest avoids helping out that man is to walk to the other side. Think about the Levite, walks to the other side. Then you get to the Good Samaritan. The first thing he does is he walks toward him, right? He goes toward this person who is suffering. Think about the story of Lazarus and the rich man, right? There's this rich man who has like a feast every day in his mansion or whatever. And right outside the gate is Lazarus, who, by the way, is the only figure named in any of Jesus's parables. The only person with, like, even the Good Samaritan doesn't have a name, right? His name's not like Joe or whatever. Lazarus is the only person with a name. He's poor. He's covered with sores. He's longing to eat. He's hungry. And there's something about the fact that the rich man walks right by him every single day and then has like a party for all of his friends that is especially galling. So what I get from that, and also from a basic intuitive common sense perspective, is that geographical and physical proximity confers moral obligations and responsibilities. Like if you're physically close to somebody else, then you have a certain kind of moral responsibility to attend to what they are going through. And our communities are actually geographically and residentially segregated, though even in many cases not that far, right? But they are segregated precisely so that people don't have to care as much about what other people are going through. Like it's uncomfortable to be confronted with people who are going through things when you're experiencing relative comfort and luxury and so forth. And so those aren't things that we really want to think about. We don't want to think about like, why do I have so much when somebody else has so little? We don't want to think about like, are there ways in which I have contributed to systems that have resulted in these inequities? That's also very uncomfortable. And I think that the promise of the gospel and the power of God's grace is that God can create fellowship and community across these traditional social lines, and that Christians who hope for heaven and aren't supposed to be consumed with their earthly lives, at least not as much as those who don't have a heavenly hope do. Um, we should be more open and receptive to the possibilities of entering into communities that challenge us out of certain, like benefits that we've received that we don't need as we've received them, where we have like plenty to give, and where we have the opportunity to give in a way where you're often receiving even more in return through the spiritual benefit and many other benefits of being in communities of very different life circumstances.
Yeah, it's definitely much easier to, as somebody who has the benefit of being comfortable or living in luxury, to ignore that other people don't. And when you don't see them, when they don't live in your neighborhood, it's a lot easier to go about your day, 100%. And that's an interesting point about Lazarus being named in that parable, that he's the
Mm-hmm.
only one. I think that is supposed to signal something to the reader about how important that person is. Um, but I guess we should get back to, again, maybe just tying this into your book and where you see Augustine come into this and how his writings have informed the perception that you've just outlined. Where do you see that connection, and yeah, maybe just draw that out a little bit more.
Yeah, so I I connect Augustine's emphasis on visible church unity with Jesus's prayer in John 17. I pray that they would be one as you and I are, as
Hmm.
I'm one with the Father, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. Right? For me, that means that there's a visible component to Christian unity, and it's really interesting that Jesus says, essentially, people are more likely to trust in me and trust that I am, God and human, I am the divine word in the flesh. They're going to be more likely to believe in that if they see Christians in harmony with each other. And they are going to be less willing to believe that if they see Christians disunited and divided against each other, which is so empirically true. right? It's so
Mm-hmm.
obvious that, if you see people of very different stripes who typically wouldn't get along and they have fellowship in Jesus Christ, people wonder, what is that? And then you see people, people who claim to be Christian who are like totally divided and are at each other's throats. Are like, I don't know that there's anything to this religion if that's
Mm-hmm.
what people who claim the name of Jesus act like, right? It's so empirically obvious and intuitively, makes sense that why Jesus would pray this. So all that to say that, Augustine puts a little bit more bones on that in his defense of visible church unity. And one of the most important passages that he reflects on is the one about the parable of the wheat and the tares. And the idea is that you have a field where you have the wheat and the tares growing alongside each other. There's a question of whether or not you should pull out the tares who are sort of harassing the wheat, or like, it's sort of like these weeds who are like messing up the field. And the answer is no, let them grow together. It's Christ who will separate them only at the end of time. And so what Augustine does with that is he talks about how our churches are mixed communities, that all Christians struggle with sin anyway. So you can't be in church without being upset at a Christian, at another Christian, or making them upset at you. There's actually a lot of false Christians in the church who might not be inwardly converted, and that's also an issue that you'll deal with in any church community. And Augustine's time, that's especially the case because he's writing with the ascent of imperial Christianity, when it's sort of like the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. And so there's a lot of people who are becoming Christian for just like social or political or material reasons. So there's just like a lot of people who are just sort of like taking on the name Christian when they're not really sincere
Mm-hmm.
about the faith, from what you can tell. Um, there's a couple of implications of this from my perspective. One is that you should expect to be in fellowship with people that you strongly disagree with, or that you think are very immoral, and that's part of the Christian life. Another is that that we can be faithful in contexts like that precisely because our salvation is on the basis of Christ and his grace, and not on the basis of our associations. So you're not allowed to say to somebody like, I can't believe that you're part of that community when there's people who do this or that. Well, the answer is like, well, I don't do this or that. Like, you shouldn't do this or that. So it's not like an excuse to go along with the crowd, but then that's your
Mm-hmm.
sin. But if you're not doing it, and if you're challenging it, and if you're frustrated with it, but you're still in fellowship with those people, then that's actually, for Augustine, the Christian way. Like, we all have to do that to a certain extent because none of our communities is perfect. But he really wants to say, no, your salvation is by grace through Christ. You're not saved on the basis of how great, the people in your church are. Like, that's a very weird way to think about salvation. Therefore, you shouldn't condemn somebody because of their associations or what groups they're in. I mean, if you just start with that, you already address a lot of issues of polarization in broader society, I think. If you go a little further, Augustine will say that, um, you know, what's like the most singular instance of, like, what's the most singular practice of Christian unity within the church? What practice do we do that most symbolizes Christian unity? Communion. And it's
Mm-hmm.
called union, like community union, obviously. Who was it started by? Jesus in the Lord's Supper. Who participated? Judas Iscariot.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That didn't invalidate Peter's participation in the Lord's Supper. That didn't invalidate John or whoever else. Jesus, broke bread and shared wine with the, defining instance of a traitor in Christian history, the one who betrayed Jesus, during the, inaugural event of the Christian practice that most signifies visible fellowship. So Jesus did it, and Judas was, you could say, his enemy, and that he betrayed Jesus. And so when Jesus says, love your enemy, one of the things that you really have to wrestle with is whether or not, like, that enemy might actually just be somebody that you are in Christian fellowship with. And that's often the relationships where we find that we find the most vexing and frustrating, because they're the closest, because you have higher expectations of them, because you have more in common with them. And another step that I would go is to say, maybe in fact, being in fellowship with people that you really disagree with and that you're very frustrated with is a really important way that God grows us spiritually. Because it's so easy to be in fellowship with people who are exactly the same. When you're in fellowship with people you really, have a problem with, that teaches you patience and humility and forgiveness and self-reflection, ways, forces you to say like, well, I'm a sinner too. I don't feel like I'm as bad as that person, but I do have to say I'm a sinner. And also that person is an image bearer of God. I believe that. Like, what does that mean in terms of what I'm saying? Um, those are some places where I would start. I think it does get very, very complicated, though, when you get to questions of race or other power disparities or forms of domination, when you're thinking about like unity in a highly misogynist context where, a woman has experienced sexual assault and the church hasn't, dealt with it properly. So I don't believe in unity at all costs. And I think that when you're talking about a situation of abuse and there's a severe power disparity, you are not required, I don't think, to stay in that context in the name of unity. I think there's a way in which invoking unity can be very oppressive.
Hmm.
At the same time, I think that some of the things that Augustine says theologically about how we interact with each other are things that those who are in really marginalized situations can still think about. To think about, because Christ is the source of my salvation, I'm not defined by what other people do to me. I am not defined by the way that I've been oppressed, the way that people look down upon me, the way that I've been violated. My salvation is in Christ. That even as I, separate from this community, there's a way in which I want that to be a form of loving discipline against them. And I pray for the restoration. And this is like really hard to talk about. I mean, it's very, very sensitive when you're talking about, severe moral, physical violations. But there's something along the lines of that I want to retrieve from Augustine, which I think is a different conversation when you're talking about like, people who disagree about predestination, free will, or Eucharist or something like that, and they're like sort of equal. So I don't think you can appropriate Augustine's teachings about unity when you're in a situation of like unilateral offense, where one person is really harming the other. But what I'm trying to explore, and I haven't figured it out yet, is how can you still take Christian unity seriously in situations like that, where if there's a situation of oppression, it's very clear like the oppressor has to repent in order for there to be a restoration of fellowship. And then we can have a conversation about, whether the oppressed forgives. But I think you don't go there too quick before you really talk about redressing the offense.
Yeah, that's such a powerful word. And again, there's so much there and so much nuance that you need, which I think you are the one to walk that line and to figure it out, because it is, and you can never say like the exact formula that means that it's okay to split a church, or in this scenario, it is unacceptable to split up, right? You can never have that kind of formulaic thing. But I think we would both agree that when you look at church today, the way that the Protestant church works with however many denominations we have, if you picture Augustine, who's talking at a time when there is still only one church, like you said, there's one church and then a bunch of schismatic little tiny offshoots. But as far as he can see, there's only one church. If he saw what happened, if he saw what was going on today, even just between Catholics and Protestants and the Eastern Orthodox, let alone the thousands and thousands of denominations that there are within that, he would not be happy about it. I think we could both agree he would be unhappy. Mm-hmm. But so, like, with that in mind, what do we do about it? Because that is the way that it is, and Jesus is alive and well in all of these different denominations, and there's faithful Christians in all these denominations. And so I guess my question to you is like, what do we do about it? How do we try to have that impact us in a positive way, other than just being like, dang, we really messed this up? But it's all we have to use at this point. So
yeah, it's such a hard question. Especially when you think about how our churches are so polarized right now. And there's so many pastors who are burnt out because they just can't hold the congregation together, because there's so much like vituperative hatred, from one side against the other and vice versa. So, I'm not like holding out hope for like this one church to materialize from all the denominations and traditions within my lifetime or whatever. But the way that I'm approaching it is that when the church is so divided and polarized, and there's really complex reasons why it would be, and there's some reasons why, it might be appropriate to divide, and other cases in which it's not. But when you generally see a sort of like disarray amongst Christians, you have to ask if there's a sort of like a deeper spiritual sickness there. Like you have to ask if the church is sort of, unhealthy deeper down. And it then ceases to be just an issue of like who's right on XYZ issue and who's wrong on, the same thing. It's sort of like, is there something about the way that we're conducting our affairs that indicates that there's like a disease behind the symptoms? And my perspective is that over the course of the church's history, even from like the time of Corinth, the Corinthians or whatever, the church has, gone through spiritual ups and downs sort of collectively. Like it's waxed and waned in its faithfulness to Christ. And when you see times the church has gotten very corrupt, you often see renewal movements arise. Think of like monasticism or St. Francis of Assisi or like German pietism or whatever. And they typically are characterized by a kind of like renewed interest and appreciation in the basics of Christianity. Like, what did Jesus do? What was like the first church like in Acts 2 and 4? It's often coupled with confession and repentance and a going back to the basics. It's often correlated with a renunciation of wealth and luxury and a new interest in caring for the poor and doing visible good works. And it's not typically coming from like the centers of power within church leadership. It's typically coming from like these new people who see what's wrong with the church, but are still committed to it. And they become a renewal movement for, the broader community. So to my mind, I don't think, U.S. Christianity is in like its glory days right now. I think we have like a lot of spiritual problems in the church. But that's sort of, but at the same time, like I feel like I'm like seeing the kingdom of God every day in my community. And so I feel like if you go to the margins of society, if you sort of rediscover what, the prophets and the gospels and basically the whole Bible says about the poor, and you really wrestle with what does it mean when Jesus says, blessed are the poor? By which I didn't say in spirit. It says poor in spirit is in Matthew. Blessed are the poor is in Luke. There's no in spirit. You can't just spiritualize this. And it's not clear how you can be poor in spirit when you're rich in body, right? Because wealth leads to pride and arrogance and entitlement. So if you really wrestle with those kinds of questions, that's often, correlated with a kind of spiritual renewal. And I feel like we've seen this in the history of the church. And I sort of feel like, that's what I'd want to point Christians to now, to say, why don't we go back to the basics and see what this is all about? And then why don't we try to find out where is the kingdom vibrant and active? And it's probably not in the places that are most featured in, in like news media or like the most powerful churches or whatever.
Yeah, that's such an inspiring vision. I share with your hope for renewal in the future. And you're somebody who walks the walk. You're somebody who lives this life with people who are different than you, who's willing to be uncomfortable. And I think that's what gives your research and your interaction with Augustine and your writing so powerful, is you've seen this happen. Not that you've done it perfectly, but you've seen it happen and you've seen the fruits of it. It's just a really cool testimony to the way Jesus has worked in your life, the way he's positioned you and your family. I just think it's really great. So thanks so much for sharing.
Thanks, Will. It's great to be with you.